The clock read 9:01 a.m. I was disposable. A problem solved with a simple signature. His words were like broken glass, cuts I couldn't yet feel. It's better if you don't come back. The silence inside my head was absolute, a void where my ego once lived. He thought I was gone, but I was just beginning to calculate the cost. He saw an end. I saw a masterclass in silent destruction. He had no idea that at 10:01 a.m. I wouldn't just be back. I would be his god. The morning air felt unusually heavy, like a warning my body understood, but my mind chose to ignore. I walked through those glass doors at 8:45 a.m., thinking it was just another Tuesday in the life of a loyal soldier. I had spent 5 years building this place, sacrificing my weekends and my sleep for a vision that wasn't even mine. I poured my soul into every project, believing the lie that hard work alone would secure my seat at the table. But as I walked past the cubicles, the atmosphere shifted, and the silence from my colleagues felt like a sharp blade. They didn't look at me. They looked at their screens, their faces reflecting the blue light of a betrayal already in motion. My boss's assistant didn't smile as she usually did. She just pointed toward the corner office with a cold, mechanical gesture. The walk toward that door felt like a mile, each step echoing against the marble floor like a drumbeat for my own execution. I opened the door and saw him sitting there, leaning back in his expensive leather chair, looking at a folder that contained my entire career. He didn't invite me to sit, he didn't offer coffee, and he didn't even look up for the first 30 seconds of my arrival. The power dynamic was established before a single word was spoken, a classic move to make me feel small and insignificant. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, and with every tick I felt the walls of the prison I had built for myself closing in. When he finally looked up, his eyes were empty of any gratitude or history, replaced by the cold calculation of a man who only sees people as numbers. He cleared his throat, and the sound felt like the cocking of a gun, ready to fire the bullet that would end my professional life. "We've decided to move in a different direction," he said, his voice as flat and soulless as the grey carpet beneath us. Those 7 words felt like a physical blow to my chest, stealing the oxygen from the room before I could even formulate a response. He didn't say we were downsizing or that the company was struggling. He said the company was fine, but I was no longer a part of its future. I looked at the folder on his desk, the one filled with my record-breaking sales and the late-night strategies that saved his reputation more than once. None of it mattered now, because the ego in front of me had decided that my competence was becoming a threat to his absolute control. He spoke about cultural fit and new energy, using the corporate code for the fact that I was too expensive and too independent for his comfort. I felt a surge of heat rising from my neck, a mixture of pure rage and the cold realization that my loyalty had been a one-way street. I wanted to shout about the hours I had lost and the sacrifices I had made, but my throat felt like it was filled with dry sand. The man I had helped build into a millionaire was now looking at his watch, signaling that my 5 years of life were worth less than 5 minutes of his time. He pushed a single piece of paper across the desk, a severance agreement that felt more like a bribe for my silence than a reward for my service. "Sign it, pack your things, and try not to make a scene on your way out," he added, his tone dripping with a patronizing pity that hurt more than the firing itself. I realized then that I wasn't just being let go. I was being erased from the history of the very walls I helped to paint. The office I had called home now looked like a crime scene, and I was the body they were trying to hide before the next meeting started. I picked up the pen, but my hand didn't shake. Instead, a strange, icy calm began to settle over my nerves for the first time in years. I didn't sign the paper. I just left the pen resting on the desk, a small act of defiance that he didn't even notice. I stood up and walked out of the office, feeling the weight of 1,000 eyes on my back as I headed toward my desk for the last time. Packing my life into a single cardboard box took exactly 4 minutes, a humiliating realization of how little we actually own in these corporate cages. The security guard, a man I had greeted by name every morning for years, now stood a few feet away, waiting to escort me out like a criminal. I walked through the lobby, and the air from the street hit my face with a sharpness that finally woke up my sleeping senses. Standing on the sidewalk with my box in my hands, I watched the taxis go by and realized that the world hadn't stopped just because my universe had collapsed. The shame I expected to feel was slowly being replaced by a terrifyingly clear sense of purpose that I had never felt before. I looked back at the glass tower, a giant monument to greed and ego, and I didn't see a workplace anymore. I saw a target. He thought he had destroyed me at 9 a.m., but he had actually done me the greatest favor of my life by cutting the chains. My mind began to race, not with sorrow, but with the cold, hard numbers of the company's secret vulnerabilities that only I knew. I remembered the hidden debts, the disgruntled shareholders, and the fragile ego of the man who thought he was untouchable. The victim who walked into that building an hour ago was dead, and something much more dangerous had taken his place. I put the box in the back of my car and sat behind the steering wheel, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I didn't see a man who had lost his job. I saw a man who was about to go to war, and for the first time, I knew I was going to win. The clock on the dashboard clicked over to 10 a.m., and the first move of the protocol was already forming in the shadows of my mind. The drive home was a blur of neon lights and meaningless noise, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I didn't turn on the radio. The only sound in the car was the heavy, rhythmic thumping of my own heart against my ribs. When I reached my apartment, the silence inside felt different. No longer a sanctuary, but a cold, empty box that mirrored my sudden insignificance. I put the cardboard box from the office on the kitchen floor, the sound of it hitting the tiles echoing like a dull thud in a hollow cave. I sat on the floor next to it, not moving, for what felt like hours, watching the shadows of the setting sun crawl across the walls. My ego was screaming for me to call him, to beg for my job back, or to send a desperate email explaining my value one more time. But beneath that scream was a cold, whispering voice that I had never heard before, the voice of a predator who had just spotted a fatal flaw. I reached into the bottom of the box, underneath the useless pens and the framed photos, and pulled out a plain black external hard drive. He thought I was just a loyal employee who did what he was told, but he forgot that I was the one who built his internal servers. I knew every digital footprint he had ever left, every deleted email, and every creative accounting move he used to hide his losses from the board. I plugged the drive into my laptop, and the soft blue light of the screen illuminated my face in the dark room like a ghost returning from the grave. The fan of the computer began to whir, a low, steady hum that felt like the engine of a massive war machine finally starting up. I stared at the folders, thousands of files containing the true history of his greed, his lies, and the fragile house of cards he called a company. Most people in my position would be looking for another job on LinkedIn, but I wasn't looking for a paycheck anymore. I was looking for a leverage point. I realized that he hadn't just fired me. He had accidentally handed me the keys to his own execution by letting me walk out with what was in my head. I spent the next 48 hours in a trance, fueled by nothing but black coffee and the burning desire for a reckoning. The laptop screen became my entire world, a digital battlefield where I began to map out every single crack in his untouchable armor. I started with the offshore accounts, the ones he thought were buried deep enough to survive any audit or prying eye. He was moving money like a magician moves cards, hiding the company's mounting debts behind a curtain of fake profits and inflated projections. But I knew the logic of his lies, the specific patterns he used when he was scared, because I had seen him sweat in meetings when the numbers didn't align. His ego was so massive that he actually believed he was smarter than the math, a fatal mistake that every narcissist eventually makes. I found the emails he sent to the board of directors, promising them growth that was physically impossible, built on a foundation of pure fiction. He wasn't just a bad boss. He was a gambler playing a high-stakes game with other people's lives, and he had just bet against the wrong man. As I scrolled through the encrypted messages, I found the Special Projects folder, a collection of secret deals that bypassed every legal and ethical boundary. He was planning to sell the company's most valuable assets behind the board's back, a move that would leave thousands of employees homeless while he walked away with a golden parachute. My fingers trembled slightly as I realized the scale of the disaster he was inviting, but the tremble wasn't from fear, it was from the thrill of the hunt. I saw the names of the shareholders he was manipulating, people who trusted him with their life savings while he spent their money on a lifestyle he couldn't afford. He thought he was the master of the game, but he didn't realize that I was now the one holding the rulebook, and I was about to rewrite every single page. Every document I opened felt like another nail in the coffin of his career, a piece of evidence that would eventually turn his empire into a heap of ashes. I didn't just want to take his job, I wanted to take the very air he breathed, to leave him standing in the middle of a ruins he created himself. By 4 a.m. on the third day, the blueprint for his destruction was no longer a collection of files, it was a living, breathing weapon. I sat back and watched the sun begin to bleed through the curtains, realizing that I was no longer the man who had been fired. The fear of being unemployed had vanished, replaced by the terrifying clarity of a soldier who has found the enemy's only weak point. I knew that to destroy a man like him, you don't attack his body or his office, you attack the one thing he worships, his reputation. I opened an encrypted email client and prepared a series of anonymous packages, each one containing just enough truth to create a panic, but not enough to reveal my identity. I sent the first set of documents to the company's biggest rival, a firm that had been trying to find a gap in his defense for over a decade. Then, I sent a different set of files to the most aggressive investigative journalist in the city, someone known for hunting corporate sharks. I wasn't looking for a quick kill. I wanted a slow, agonizing realization for him that the walls were closing in and there was nowhere to hide. I imagined him walking into the office that morning, smelling the same expensive coffee, unaware that the air around him was already beginning to burn. He would see the first headline or receive the first frantic call from a board member, and he would think it was just a minor glitch in his perfect world. He had no idea that I had spent the last 48 hours planting landmines under every single path he could take to escape. I felt a strange sense of peace as I clicked the send button on the final message, a digital executioner pulling the lever. The game was no longer about a job or a salary. It was about the fundamental protocol of power, the one that says, if you strike at the king, you must not miss. I closed my laptop, walked to the window and looked out at the city as it began to wake up, knowing that by noon his world would never be the same. I had decoded the blueprint of his life, and now I was going to use it to build a monument to his failure. The first week of my transition from a victim to a predator was spent in total isolation, my apartment becoming a labyrinth of printed balance sheets and complex financial maps. I knew that to buy a company of that size, I didn't need millions in my bank account. I needed the trust of the people who were already tired of his arrogance. Power, in its purest form, is not about ownership, it is about control, and I was about to prove that a man with the right information is more dangerous than a man with a heavy wallet. I spent my nights reaching out to the ghost investors, the silent partners who had been sidelined by his ego for years, the ones who had the capital but lacked the courage to strike. I didn't call them from my personal phone. I used encrypted channels, presenting myself not as a fired employee, but as a strategic advisor with a terminal solution for their failing investment. I met the first investor in a dimly lit corner of an old library, the smell of ancient paper and cold stone providing the perfect backdrop for a conversation about a corporate assassination. He looked at the data I had compiled, the evidence of the boss's hidden debts and the secret asset sales, and I watched the color drain from his face as the reality set in. "He's burning the house down while we're still inside," the investor whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and newfound clarity. I leaned forward, the shadows of the bookshelves masking my expression, and I told him that I was the only one who could put out the fire if he gave me the authority to act on his behalf. I wasn't asking for a job or a favor. I was offering him a way to save his fortune by sacrificing the man who was currently flushing it down the drain. By the time we walked out of that library, I didn't just have an ally. I had a blank check and a mandate to start a quiet, systematic, hostile takeover. I repeated this process 4 more times, moving like a shadow through the city's financial districts, collecting promises and power like a collector of rare, lethal artifacts. The gathering storm was now invisible to the naked eye, a pressure change in the atmosphere that he was too arrogant to notice from his penthouse office. He thought the anonymous leaks I had sent earlier were just a string of bad luck, but I was actually using those leaks to drive the stock price down, making it cheaper for my silent partners to buy in. Every time he walked onto the news to deny the rumors, he was actually digging his own grave, and I was the one holding the shovel. I began to realize that the most effective way to destroy a kingdom is from the inside out, by turning the king's own guards against him. I reached out to the 3 most influential board members, the ones who had been with the company since the beginning, and felt a personal sting from his recent erratic decisions. These weren't just business meetings, they were psychological operations where I used every piece of leverage I had gathered during my years of service. I knew their personal fears, their financial vulnerabilities, and their secret resentments toward the man who had stopped listening to them a long time ago. In private steakhouse booths and darkened boardrooms, I showed them the special projects folder I had found, the proof that their CEO was ready to betray them for his own survival. I watched as their loyalty, built over decades, evaporated in a single hour of cold, hard truth that I presented with surgical precision. "You have 2 choices," I told them, my voice a low, steady hum in the quiet rooms. "You can go down with the ship he's sinking, or you can help me change the captain." I didn't ask them to vote him out yet. I asked them to start questioning his every move in public, to create a climate of doubt that would make the stock market even more nervous. Every time he tried to assert his authority, a board member would now push back with a pointed question about the hidden debts I had leaked to them. I was orchestrating a symphony of chaos from my kitchen table, watching on my monitors as the company's internal communication channels began to catch fire with rumors and fear. He was becoming paranoid, accusing his closest allies of treason, not realizing that he was the one who had invited the wolf into the house by firing me. I felt a grim satisfaction as I watched the stock price dip further every single day, each cent lost being $1 of profit for the silent coalition I was building. I was buying up the company's soul piece by piece, while he was still convinced that he owned the building it was housed in. The gathering storm was no longer a distant threat. It was a dark, suffocating cloud that was beginning to block out the sun from his office windows. He thought he was fighting a ghost, a series of unfortunate events, but he was actually fighting a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. By the end of the 2nd week, the trap was set, and the tension in the air was so thick it felt like it could shatter at any moment. I received a confidential text message from my lead investor at 11 p.m. confirming that we now controlled 51% of the voting shares through our network of shell companies and proxy board members. I sat in my dark living room, the only light coming from the glowing green numbers on my screen that signaled his total financial vulnerability. He had spent the day in emergency meetings trying to stop the bleeding, unaware that the surgeon was the very man he had called dispensable just days ago. I looked at the legal documents spread across my table, the ones that would officially transfer the title of chairman to a representative of my choosing, until I decided to reveal myself. It was a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. He had the building, the brand, and the title, but I had the math, the secrets, and the people. I imagined him staring out at the city, wondering where it all went wrong, looking for an enemy he could see and fight. But you can't fight a shadow, and you certainly can't fight a ghost who knows exactly where you buried your skeletons. The final move of the gathering storm was to schedule a surprise board meeting for the next morning, the same time he had fired me exactly 2 weeks prior. I drafted the agenda myself, a single line that read, "Vote of no confidence and immediate restructuring of executive leadership." I felt no pity, no hesitation. I only felt the clinical satisfaction of a plan coming to its natural, inevitable conclusion. The storm was no longer gathering. It was here, and the first lightning strike was timed for 9 a.m. sharp. I closed the laptop for the night, but I didn't sleep. I just watched the clock, counting down the minutes until I could walk back into that glass tower. I wasn't going back to get my old desk or an apology. I was going back to collect the debt that ego and arrogance had accrued. The sun began to rise over the city, a cold grey morning that signalled the end of his era and the beginning of mine. The clock hit 8:45 a.m., the exact minute I had walked into this building 2 weeks ago as a loyal soldier. I wore a black suit, tailored and sharp. A suit that didn't just command respect, it demanded total submission. As I stepped through the revolving glass doors, the security guard's eyes widened in a mixture of confusion and instinctive fear. He moved to block my path, remembering the order to keep me out, but I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I handed him a single sheet of paper with the legal stamp of the board of directors, a document that transformed him from my guard to my servant in a heartbeat. "The meeting is on the top floor," I said, my voice cutting through the lobby's air like a cold blade. "And you're going to open the door for me." The elevator ride felt like a journey through time, each floor I passed representing a year of my life I had given to a man who didn't deserve it. I watched the numbers climb, my reflection in the polished metal doors looking back at me with eyes that were no longer human. They were the eyes of the protocol. When the doors opened on the penthouse floor, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of expensive cologne and the electric charge of a dying empire. The secretary who had once pointed me toward my execution now stood up, her hands trembling as she tried to find words that no longer mattered. I walked past her without a glance, my boots echoing against the marble floor with the rhythmic precision of a ticking time bomb. I could hear his voice through the heavy oak doors of the boardroom, loud, arrogant and desperate, still trying to bully the people who had already betrayed him. He was shouting about loyalty and temporary setbacks, unaware that the man who had orchestrated his downfall was standing just inches away. I stood there for a moment, savoring the silence before the scream, feeling the weight of the takeover documents in my hand. This wasn't just a meeting, it was an exorcism, and I was the one who had come to cast out the demon of his ego. I pushed the heavy doors open, and the sound of his shouting died instantly, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like the room had lost all its air. He was standing at the head of the long mahogany table, his face flushed with anger, pointing a finger at a board member who refused to look him in the eye. When he saw me, his expression shifted from rage to a twisted, mocking smile, the smile of a man who still thinks he's holding all the cards. "You?" he sneered, his voice dripping with the same patronizing poison he had used 2 weeks ago. "I thought I told security to throw the trash out on the street." I didn't answer immediately. I walked to the opposite end of the table, pulled out the heavy leather chair, and sat down with a slow, deliberate grace. The board members sat in a frozen line, their eyes darting between me and the man who was about to lose everything, their silence being the loudest confession of their betrayal. "You're trespassing," he barked, slamming his fist on the table, the glass of water in front of him rattling like his crumbling nerves. "Get out before I have you arrested." I leaned forward, the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows behind me casting my face into a dark, unreadable shadow. "I'm not trespassing, Edward," I said, using his first name for the first time in 5 years, watching his eyes twitch at the sudden lack of a title. "I'm here to audit my new investment." I pulled the final takeover documents from my folder and slid them across the polished wood, the paper gliding with a hiss that sounded like a snake in the grass. He grabbed the papers, his hands shaking as he scanned the legal jargon, his brain struggling to process the reality that his 51% had vanished into the shadows. I watched the color drain from his face, his skin turning a sickly shade of gray, as he realized that the anonymous buyers he had been fighting were all standing behind me. He looked at the board members, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, looking for a loyal face in a room full of ghosts he had created himself. "This is impossible," he whispered, the arrogance in his voice replaced by a hollow, fragile fear that made him look older and smaller than I had ever seen him. I didn't smile, because a professional doesn't celebrate the kill, they just ensure the job is finished with surgical precision. The room was so quiet that I could hear the faint, frantic scratching of his fingernails against the edge of the mahogany table. "You're fired, Edward," I said, the words mirroring exactly what he had said to me, but this time they carried the weight of a multi-million-dollar empire behind them. I pulled out a single sheet of paper, the same severance agreement he had pushed toward me 2 weeks ago, and placed it on top of the pile. "I didn't sign yours, but I expect you to sign mine," I added, my voice as cold and unchanging as the winter sky outside. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic pleading that made me realize how hollow he truly was, without his title and his chair. He realized then that he wasn't just losing a job, he was losing his identity, his power, and the very foundation of the ego he had built over a lifetime of stepping on others. The board members remained silent, a jury of shadows that had already passed their verdict long before I entered the room. Edward's hand trembled as he reached for the pen, the same expensive fountain pen he used to sign away my career, now becoming the instrument of his own professional suicide. As the ink hit the paper, I felt a strange sense of release, not the hot rush of anger, but the cool, clinical satisfaction of a mathematical equation finally being balanced. I stood up, not waiting for him to finish, because he was no longer a factor in my reality. He was just a ghost in a suit. "You have 10 minutes to pack your things," I told him, looking at my watch as the seconds ticked by with a newfound rhythm. "Security will escort you to the curb, just like you wanted for me." I walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city that now felt like it belonged to me, or at least to the version of me that was smart enough to take it. The disposable soldier was gone, and in his place stood a man who understood that power is never given, it is only ever seized by those who know where to look. As I heard the heavy boardroom doors close behind him for the last time, I didn't feel like celebrating. I felt like I had simply followed a protocol that was written long ago. The clock on the wall hit 10:01 a.m., and as I sat in the chair at the head of the table, I knew that the real game was only just beginning. The building didn't feel different now that I owned it. It felt smaller. I sat in that massive leather chair, looking at the same walls that had once felt like a prison, and I realized a truth that most people spend their entire lives ignoring. Power isn't about the office, the title, or the money in the bank. Power is the ability to walk away from a toxic game and then buy the entire board. Most people, when they are fired or insulted, react with emotion. They scream, they cry, or they fall into a hole of self-pity. But emotion is the luxury of the weak. Strategy is the weapon of the survivor. Edward didn't lose because I was smarter than him. He lost because he believed his own lie, the lie that some people are disposable. In the world of the protocol, no one is disposable if they know how to observe, how to wait, and how to strike when the ego of the enemy has made them blind. I looked at the cardboard box sitting on the floor, the same one I had carried out in shame 2 weeks ago. And I didn't see failure in it. I saw the seed of a revolution. If you are listening to this, and you feel like you are at your lowest point, like the world has decided you are no longer needed, remember this moment. Your value isn't determined by the person who signs your paycheck. It is determined by the secrets you keep and the moves you prepare while everyone else thinks you are defeated. Don't seek an apology from those who hurt you. Seek a position where their apology no longer matters. The greatest revenge isn't a loud confrontation. It is a silent, overwhelming success that leaves your enemies wondering how the shadow they stepped on became the mountain they now have to climb. I am not the same man who walked through those doors at 9 a.m., and I hope you aren't the same person who started listening to this story. The clock is always ticking, but now it's ticking on my terms. This story isn't just about a job. It's about the fundamental laws of human psychology and power. If you found a part of yourself in this journey, then you are already part of the protocol. Hit the subscribe button if you are ready to stop being a pawn and start being the player. Comment below with the word power if you have ever turned a defeat into a victory. And remember, The loudest noise in the world is the silence of a man who is planning his next move. Until next time.